I'm Dr. Karen Walshe, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Graduate School of Education, University of Exeter. And for some time now, I've become increasingly interested in the ways that we talk about understanding and the diverse ways in which this complex concept is understood. What might be meant by understanding is hugely contested and has been hotly debated over the years by educators, researchers, philosophers, and there is no clear consensus about what we actually mean by understanding. So, during this debate, educators, philosophers, and researchers have explored important questions, such as what is the relationship between knowledge and understanding? Where does one end and the other begin? Is there one type of understanding or several? So is this thing that we call understanding the same in every context? Or is it perhaps discipline and domain specific? So is what it means to understand in history or science the same or different to what it means to understand in my own subject, religious education? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for understanding? So in other words, what has to be there for us to be able to say that understanding exists? And what is the relationship between understanding and belief? So can we only ever be said to truly understand something if we adopt it into our own worldview? But in spite of this ongoing debate and these important and complex questions, there is still no clear consensus of what we mean by understanding. And this is problematic because if we don't know what counts as understanding, then how are we as educators going to be able to teach for understanding? And how are we as learners going to know when we've actually achieved it? It's my interest in these questions that led me to conduct a research project with trainee teachers at the Universities of Birmingham and Exeter, and it's the result of this project that I'd like to share with you today. We invited secondary school trainee teachers of religious education to talk to us about what they think was meant by understanding. And to begin with, their conversations mirrored the kinds of debates that we've just seen in the literature, as they explored things like, is real understanding only possible from an insider perspective? So in other words, can a person inside a religious tradition be the only person who can really understand that religious tradition? Is understanding it, really understanding it, not possible for an outsider? But what really struck me about their conversations was the way that they resorted to using figurative and metaphorical language, because it seemed to be the only way that they could really express what they were trying to say about this really complex concept. So the most frequently metaphor that they used was understanding is seeing. And if you're at all like me, and have had to wear glasses from a very young age, you will be very familiar with an optician's optical frame. And you'll know exactly how it feels when you go to the opticians and you're asked to read the chart in front of you and it's all a blur until the optician plays around with lenses, putting one in, taking one out, flipping it over, trying another lens, and then all of a sudden you can see clearly as if for the first time. And that's really what our trainee teachers were saying about understanding. That's how it feels. It feels like that kind of clarity of thought, just like clarity of vision. The other thing about the optical frame, which I think is really good, is that it gives us an impression that there are different lenses that we can put on. And when we do, we see things differently. We see things from multiple perspectives. The second most popular metaphor, actually, the other thing about this metaphor of seeing is that for these trainee teachers, seeing was not sufficient. It was almost too passive. One has to do more than that. One has to actually look. So it's deliberate and conscious, intentional action. The second most popular metaphor that our trainee teachers used was understanding as constructing. And if we think about understanding in this way, then it allows us to think about the building blocks of knowledge and how it feels when we put different blocks together. We begin to see patterns and themes. We work out where blocks should go in order to create the whole picture, and we build bridges between those disparate pieces of information. But what's interesting about this particular metaphor is it also tells us that understanding is like deconstructing, where we can take apart the whole, where we can look at very particular pieces of information, elements of key concepts, and by understanding that more clearly, we can get a better understanding of the whole. The final metaphor that our trainee teachers talked about was understanding as grasping. And this metaphor is actually very clearly relates to another word that we use for understanding very frequently and often used synonymously for understanding, which is grasping, comprehending rather, which actually means to grasp. So for these trainee teachers, understanding was like a kind of a mental manipulation, just as we manipulate our fingers to grasp hold of an object. For these teachers, understanding was a mental manipulation as we try to get hold of or get our heads around a particular object of study. As with all metaphors, the metaphor of grasping tells us something about our ordinary everyday experience of understanding and the frustrations that we feel when we can't get hold of an object, or when, perhaps like sand, the understanding just slips through our fingers. Why do these metaphors matter? Well, key thinkers in the field, like Lakoff and Johnson, tell us that how we think metaphorically matters because it reveals something to us about what we value most. So these three metaphors focus very much on the processes of understanding and the dynamic, intentional, developmental nature of what it feels like to come to an understanding. How we think metaphorically matters because it provides us with a way of acting towards a particular concept. So for instance, if our trainee teachers prioritise understanding as seeing, then they're going to make sure that in their lessons with their own students, they give students lots of opportunities to look at things from different angles, through different lenses, from multiple perspectives. So these metaphors have clear implications for their classroom practice. And finally, how we think metaphorically matters because whilst metaphors uncover deeply held beliefs about a particular concept, they also can constrain us because they confine us to our ordinary everyday experiences. So in this way, metaphors can hide as much as they reveal. So whilst these metaphors of seeing, constructing and grasping provide really important insights into how these trainee teachers conceptualise understanding, there is more to say. And while I was listening to our trainee teachers talking, I was struck by how, if we look at it carefully, the word understanding is itself a metaphor. It's composed of two parts, under plus standing. And we know that the Old English word understanden was used to signify to stand under, to stand before, to stand in the midst of, to support, to be in the presence of, to separate, to keep apart. And although some writers view understanding as a dead or frozen metaphor, its metaphorical power lost because we have just incorporated the word understanding into our ordinary everyday discourse. For others, it's not so much dead as frozen, its metaphorical power lying, sleeping peacefully beneath the surface. And I wonder whether now is the time to wake it up. Because if we were to conceive of understanding as having something to do with how we position ourselves in relation to the object of study, then as educators we might become less concerned with outcomes perhaps the most dominant discourse in education at the moment, and more concerned with the dynamic, intentional processes of coming to an understanding. And as learners, we might become more aware of our own positionality. We might ask ourselves, why have we chosen to position ourselves in relation to the object of understanding in the way that we have? What would happen if we looked at it from a different angle? How have our values and assumptions shaped the way we position ourselves? So as you can see, the metaphors that we use for understanding matter because they reveal something to us about what we prioritize. For instance, processes rather than outcomes. They prompt us to consider what we're focusing on more, for example, cognitive aspects of understanding rather than conative and affective. And perhaps most importantly, they give us a way of acting towards understanding. How we think about understanding matters because it will shape the way that we teach and learn. I hope you've enjoyed this consideration and exploration of why the metaphors we use for understanding matter, and thank you for watching.